Hi everybody, welcome to this week's podcast.
Hello there.
So we were looking for a case that happened around the holidays, and we came across this very strange one that occurred in Ottawa in 1963. It has some very unique details to it, but we'll get into that a little bit later. So anyhow, take it away.
The culprits were two young men who were the Binette brothers. On Sunday, December 22nd, 1963, Reverend Guillaume Chevrier welcomed more than 300 parishioners, including his distant cousin Lionel Chevrier, who was a minister of justice. The service celebrated the fourth Sunday in the Advent. The Mass started at noon, and by 12:45 there was a frantic knock on the side door of the church. It was Agathe Jensen, who lived in a third-floor apartment in the neighboring rectory. She ran to Father Chevrier, telling him that someone had been shot. So Father Chevrier stopped the service immediately, and he asked for assistance from his parish. And the four persons who answered the call were Paul Mercier, John Horner, Roger Lacroix, and Leo Binette. Horner and Mercier got to the rectory first and began to climb the stairs. About 5 steps up, Horner came face to face with a youth who was pointing a revolver at him. A voice higher up shouted in French, "We have no choice, shoot him." The young man fired 2 shots, and both Horner and Mercier fell backwards. Unhurt, Horner slumped to the ground, pretending to be dead. Mercier was not so fortunate. The parish's 22-year-old scoutmaster was shot in the chest, and he died instantly. The third volunteer, Leo Binette, hearing the gunshots, he ducked, and he scampered from the front porch of the rectory. He sprinted down Argyle Street, running for his life. When he cautiously returned, Roger Lacroix had organized several parishioners, who were mostly teenagers. He got them to surround the rectory building. That way they could prevent the perpetrators from escaping.
Yeah, and there was just a bit of a blurb from an Ottawa newspaper that I found that Roger said he really regretted having young people put in danger like that. It was him who had organized these teenagers to surround the rectory, and he said, yeah, that was such a poor choice at the time, but it was just didn't know what to do.
I mean, probably too, they were being teenagers, they weren't too afraid, probably. I don't know.
I don't know, but yeah, he definitely said that he felt bad, and they knew that the culprits were still in the rectory, so they had to do something.
So the police arrived at the scene roughly 5 minutes after receiving word that there was a shooter in the rectory. Donning their bulletproof vests, they entered the blood-splattered vestibule, and Detective Tom Flanagan slowly made his way up the stairs. On the second-floor landing, he came across the bodies of Albert Guidon, age 45, was the rectory's housekeeper, and that of a young man, who was apparently an assailant who had shot himself in the temple. The revolver, which was a German 9mm Mauser, was still clutched in his hand. Word was passed to Flanagan that another person had been spotted upstairs in a window. Detective Flanagan shouted, "Come down or we'll shoot." "I'm coming down," Flanagan heard, and seconds later the detective arrested a slight white-faced boy. They led the young man down the steps, and I froze. There was a fire inside me, and I felt cold, Leo Binette told a reporter. "It was my son, my baby. He's only 17.
So that would be absolutely horrible. Imagine that. And he lost a son. The older one took his life there, but yeah, I just couldn't even fathom.
Also found on the second floor was Doralice Béchard, age 65, who was gravely injured with gunshot wounds to her abdomen and chest. Also her sister Henadine, age 61, who had suffered a gunshot wound to her hand. The two sisters shared an apartment on the second story of the rectory. Henadine would survive. Doralice, sadly, would pass away on the operating table at the General Hospital later that day. The police also recovered a small arsenal of weapons, as well as bullets, knives, handcuffs, lengths of chains, and padlocks, along with tape, blindfolds, fishing line, and first aid kits.
Yeah, so obviously they have some big plans here.
Each of the two young Binette brothers had been armed with 2 revolvers, which they carried in homemade Western-style leather belts and holsters. In addition to the Mauser found in his dead hand, Roger packed a .45 caliber Colt-style revolver. Reginald's .45 caliber revolver was found on the kitchen table of apartment number 5, the home of Agathe Jensen. His .38 caliber revolver was found on the 4th step of the stairway leading to the 3rd floor, where he had dropped it after being told to surrender. In total, the two brothers had fired 12 shots, in which at least 7 hit people. Slugs were found in the walls of the stairwell. A bullet also shattered a 2nd-story window. The death toll could have been much higher. 12 shots, and it was what, 7? 7 hit people?
With revolvers, with young people that probably have no experience with using weapons. Yeah.
Yeah, it could have been much worse. Still pretty bad, obviously.
I think a lot of it has to do with I get the feeling that they weren't intending on actually using the guns. I think it was just more of a threat. So when they were sort of discovered by that woman, it was sort of like, oh, we're busted, and then they just started shooting. So I don't think that was their their main intention was to actually use those guns. I guess they figured having 2 revolvers each would be intimidating enough where people wouldn't want to, step in their way.
One around that time, too, Westerns was still pretty big. Movies and TV. I'm sure there would have been.
Absolutely. Actually, there was another little blurb that I read from another newspaper article about it, and one of the young men who they'd interviewed said he was watching Bonanza at the time when it sort of came on to the TV that something had happened at the church. So, yeah, Westerns were pretty big. So the revolvers and the holsters and I see what they're doing there.
Yeah. So Roger Binette's homemade ammunition pouch was found in a cardboard box wrapped in Christmas paper. It contained 6 spent cartridge cases and 38 fresh ones. Reginald's held 42 live bullets.
That's quite a lot of ammunition.
That is, and I mean, if they weren't planning on using it, they sure had a lot. So, I don't know, maybe it was just in case, but...
Yeah, we're going to get into that part of it very, very shortly, but there was a reason why they had all of this. It has to do with where they actually got the weapons from. So I believe when they got the weapons, they just grabbed all the ammunition that they could get. So I have a feeling that's why. Because they were going to obviously take it on the road, right? They were going to have to be on the run if they got away with it. So they probably would have needed it eventually,
Initially, the police believed that the Binette brothers had intended to rob the church of its Sunday collection offerings, especially given the generosity of the parish during the Christmas season. When they were discovered by Albert Guindon, their plans were foiled, so they began firing.
Yeah, exactly. So it was just more out of panic. So,
yeah,
and I'm assuming they didn't have any experience with revolvers, being 17 and 22.
And this is where things start to get very strange. So later, following interviews with the police, psychiatrists, and psychologists, The surviving brother Reginald revealed their intentions had been far more elaborate and bizarre. So the pair had intended to kidnap Father Chevrier and force him to bring them to the homes of wealthy Ottawa businessmen, from whom they would extort money. And their aim was to steal about $1 million, which back then is still a lot of money. Probably.
It would have been a lot of money. Like, this is the part of the case that sort of grabbed us, and we were thinking, like, okay, they were planning on doing this for a while. Career criminal style, you know?
Yeah.
They had some big plans here. I suppose getting at businessmen at the time would have been slightly easier, but yeah, even to do that, to insult the church that way, to intend to kidnap the priest, like some evil stuff here.
And especially too if their father was he was involved in the
parish
rescue mission. Yeah,
they were part of the parish. Like, yeah.
So they would then force neurosurgeons to implant electronic equipment in people's brains, thereby turning them into robots. And the Binette brothers would use the robotized individuals to commit crimes.
Yeah, so this is very unique for the time. So obviously there were robots in movies, and I'm sure there were, I can't say I know history of robots. I know in movies at the time. This is a very, very unique thought, though, for two young men, you know?
Yeah, especially for, like, brain implants and chips at that time. Because, only now are they just starting to do that for real.
Yeah, so just remember, this is 1963, so that's why we found this just super unique, and where would they even come up with this sort of thing? Yeah, but that was their plan, was to create robot individuals to commit crimes for them. So
they could still get away with it and not even be involved, really.
Yeah, but where did they come up with this? So,
as if that wasn't strange enough, they also wanted to build rocket ships and develop a longevity serum so they could live for about 200 to 300 years. And there were serious questions about Reginald's sanity after hearing that. Rockets being built other than NASA, or now there's companies getting into it for themselves. That's just starting to happen, and then
and they had that idea back then, 1963.
Yeah.
To do this. So, yeah, and the serum to live forever, I don't know.
There's people trying, but I don't know about making serums. It's more,
yeah, it's such a rare thing, but you're going to see momentarily something that's contributed to these thoughts.
So the Monday following the murder and unaliving, young Reginald Binette was charged with the murder of Paul Mercier. It was Reginald's 18th birthday, but since the crime had been committed the day before he turned 18, his sentence, if he was convicted, would be life imprisonment. Had he been 18 at the time he committed the murder, he would have faced the death penalty.
Yeah, so death penalty still existed in Ontario at that time, so yeah.
And Reginald looked on impassively as he was sent for psychiatric testing to see if he was sane enough to stand trial. So he wasn't even coherent enough or sane enough to really, to really even acknowledge what was happening.
No, psychiatric testing is normal. If you have committed murder, that you're definitely going to be sent for testing, irregardless of how you are appearing to the police and whatnot at the time. So he was bound to be sent for testing anyway, because murdering someone is not normal. It's not a sane thing to do. So he is going for psychiatric testing because of that. So I feel like he definitely knew what was happening at the time. He was definitely with it. His parents sat in the front row of the courtroom until his sobbing mother had to leave, escorted by her grieving husband and police constable. So, what a time for them. So, they've lost a son because of it. And also, they had another son who they were watching going through trial at 18 years of age.
For murder, of all things.
At their parish. So, it's just wild. Leo and Valida Binette, parents of the assailants, had no idea that either of their sons were actually in Ottawa at the time. The previous summer, they had sent their son Reginald to stay with his older brother Robert, who was living in BC at the time. The parents were worried that the youngest son, Reginald, was too much under the sway of his older brother, Roger. So Roger was the one who was on the scene. He was the second son involved who had passed on the scene. So they were afraid that Roger was sort of influencing young Reginald. And so they decided to send Roger away to stay with the older brother, Robert, in BC. So they were assuming that that's where he was. But Reginald was their adopted son. They had started looking after him when he was 5 months old on behalf of the Children's Aid Society. And when he turned 5, they officially adopted him. Roger Binette left home on December 8th, so that was about 2 weeks before the shooting. His parents thought that he had gone to the United States. Instead, unbeknownst to the parents, Robert and Reginald had been in touch with each other. Older brother Robert had left BC and had moved together with Roger to room 9 in a boarding house in Ottawa. So I thought that was very weird that how come the parents didn't know? Isn't anybody talking to anybody at all? Like maybe there was a falling out somewhere as well. But the parents didn't know that the boys were actually in Ottawa at the time.
Which is very strange. Like, I mean, that would have been even more of a shock when they found out who it was, especially for the dad being part of the rescue crew. See what was going on.
Yeah, not even knowing your boys were around, and then all of a sudden it's your boys that were actually doing it.
Yeah.
So Reginald was sent first to the hospital at Brockville and then to a secure government facility in Penetanguishene for psychiatric testing. Government doctors questioned him using hypnosis and drugs, Sodium Amytal in particular, a drug that is sometimes used in psychiatric interviews at the time. So it's basically considered a truth serum. If you want any more information about the facility in Penetanguishene, we also did a video about Roger Woodcock, and he was sent to the facility in Penetanguishene. He was actually sentenced to that facility. Also, he was moved to Brockville, and everything went wrong. But anyway, I'll try to link that video either in this video or in the description. Sodium amytal is a type of barbiturate, the brand name for amylbaritol. Doctors prescribe the medication as a sedative, also an anti-anxiety or pre-anesthetic before surgery. Was developed before benzodiazepines. Barbiturates were once the most popular sedative on the market, and I have to add, widely used in mental health. Roger ended up having an amytal sodium interview, also called Narcosynthesis, and it used the technique of free association as well as dream and transference materials during the session. It's used as a basis for uncovering relevant topics for later therapeutic discussion. Amytal relaxes the nervous system, induces highly euphoric effects in users. Like a truth serum, The use by investigators of truth serums, which were unreliable at best, were later banned. So I am going to link the information I was just reading to you in the description if you want to know anything else about that. Now you're going to see in this case and in other cases, using sodium amytal had more of a negative effect on Reginald. And the patients, in particular the ones that were sent there through the legal system, were basically guinea pigs. So a lot of these therapies and these interviews and whatnot were conducted experimentally, including the use of LSD, which we mentioned in that other video. But I'll link some information down below because it's quite interesting. Reginald was also given methadone, also known as methamphetamine or speed. So here's another medicine, not really medicine, pharmaceutical that was used in the psychiatric environment that ended up on the streets. Methamphetamine produces a euphoric high and can be used to increase alertness, energy, and self-confidence. It also produces harmful physiological and psychological effects, including headache, elevated heart rate, body temperature, hallucinations, and delusions.
That doesn't sound...
No, this is why, the psychiatric environment back then was very, very weird. And things that they used and things that they did are sort of torture and actually don't make any sense. Because if you're suffering mentally, especially something as serious as schizophrenia, you don't need these mind-altering, like I said, real guinea pig stuff. And there's a lot of bad stories that come out of this era.
And they were still treating mental patients pretty poorly at that time. They still sort of regarded them as not... I mean, they treated them like they were to be looked down on, but not like for being bad people. They just weren't normal people, I guess.
No, this was a time where anyone who was suffering with a mental illness was sort of hidden away from the public. And I mean, it was still happening in the 60s, probably through the 70s as well. But it was quite common if you had a family member, or especially people that upper echelon families, if you had a family member who suffered with a mental illness or disability, they kind of just homed them somewhere else. And famously, like the Kennedy family in the United States, that's exactly what happened to one of their sisters. And she didn't even have anything seriously wrong with her, but I guess
for the time it was probably
for the
bad
time
enough.
Yeah, it was considered embarrassing, and it was, so they put her in a home never to be seen again. The public didn't even really know about her until I think it was probably the mid to late 70s where it came out that there was a Kennedy sister that was in this institution, and she was definitely high functioning, I guess not to the expectations of, the wealthy and the brilliant people. But yeah, this was still happening back then. And like Danny said, unfortunately, they also weren't treated the greatest in a lot of these facilities, including experimenting with drugs on them. So methamphetamine has been abused as a street drug. Depending on its form, it can be snorted, ingested, or smoked. So the same thing happened to LSD.
Yeah.
Ended up on the streets.
It's funny how usually starts with the authorities or government-related operations that produce these drugs that become abused on the street.
And these are very, very heavy-duty drugs as well. Very heavy-duty. And there's always been sort of conspiracy about LSD being put out in the public, released sort of into the public, almost like social experiment. During his competency testing, police tracked down the guns used by the brother in the attack. They had been stolen in a vicious home invasion and robbery in June at the house of the Mayhew family. So that is how they got the guns. A home invasion and robbery. So the brothers, armed with brass knuckles, bound and gagged the Mayhew family and made off with the 4 revolvers. So Reginald was also going to be charged with assaulting Mrs. Mayhew, also discharging a firearm, causing bodily harm to the Mayhew daughter, and the robbery. So it was these charges on top of the impending murder charges. So this kid was done. I mean, the murder alone, but now they're sort of seeing some premeditation here. And it's not going to end well for him. The psychiatrist in Penetanguishene concluded that Reginald was mentally ill. He suffered from schizophrenia. He lived in a fantasy world. He also suffered from paranoia, and he had delusions of grandeur and persecution. So this is where all of those wild ideas about the rockets and the serums, I mean, obviously it comes from somewhere else too. He just wouldn't have thought of that.
No, it wouldn't just come out of nowhere unless he already knew something about it.
Yeah, there's not a whole lot about him. The research for this was very minimal. He didn't talk to any media. I don't think really anyone who was involved actually talked too much of media. It was just more of the witnesses of the incident itself. But there's not too much known about Reginald, or where these ideas came from. It would be so interesting, but obviously suffering with schizophrenia just fed it. So I believe it's like a combination of things, of influences there. It's very sad. He was only 17 when he committed the crime. His life was done when he was caught. It was over. However, he was able to understand the charges against him, and he could instruct his lawyer. So he was deemed fit to stand trial. So even though he suffered with schizophrenia and whatnot, he was still able to understand what was happening. He said he understood what he did. He understood what, the trial process. He was talking just fine to his lawyer. So they decided to go ahead and bring him to trial. Standards in law about competency to stand trial are pretty strict in Canada. But it is actually very common for someone deemed mentally ill to be confident enough to stand trial. And it has a lot to do with the premeditation in this crime in particular. There was a lot of planning and following through involved here.
And they knew what they wanted to do in the end and how to achieve it.
It wasn't random. It wasn't, it was very much planned. Reginald Binette's trial began in late April 1964. It was held in front of Justice Sam Hughes of Ontario Supreme Court. Witnesses described the horror of events on that tragic Sunday before Christmas 1963. One of the victims who survived, Nadine Béchard, was in the hospital at the time suffering from sciatica, and she was brought into the courtroom on a stretcher. So, serious enough that they wanted to bring her in there.
Good for her for doing it, too.
Yeah.
Pulling through.
Yeah. Yeah. Reginald's lawyer asked for not guilty by reason of insanity conviction. He noted that this would not mean that Reginald would be free to walk the streets. He was hoping that Reginald would be committed to the facility in Penetanguishene under a lieutenant general's warrant, where he would stay until he's cured. So if he would have gotten sentenced to that facility, it would almost guarantee his release at some point. Day passes and whatnot. Probably would go the same route as a lot of them do, where he may have been sent to Brockville, which is sort of like one more step forward into being released. So if he was not committed to Penetanguishene, chances are he was going to be committed to Kingston Pen. But the crowd would have none of it. They argued that the shooting spree was carefully planned and logical. As well, schizophrenia was not enough to justify acquittal. The judge informed the jury that with an insanity plea, the burden of proof laid with the defense counsel. As well, insanity rendered a person incapable of appreciating that an act was wrong. So, usually in this kind of case, the burden of proof is on the Crown to prove that Reginald committed the crimes. But because of the plea of insanity, it was put on to the defense, so put on to Reginald's side, to prove that he was insane. So, after a 10-day trial, Reginald Binette was found guilty of killing Paul Mercier and sentenced to life imprisonment, and the jury only deliberated for 4 hours. So that's nothing. It was just, he was done, this kid. He was done. I think the thing is, too, mental illness also wasn't really understood as much back then. So I'm sure they were fearful of having him, or having the risk of him being released onto the street at some point. And a lot of it had to do with him being schizophrenic. It just couldn't even be fathomed back then that someone who suffered a mental illness possibly could function in society. But also, he committed a murder, so obviously another strike against him. It was guaranteed he was going to be put away, either for one of the two things. And I mean, the home invasion on top of it. But I mean, he was double trouble. Mental illness, murderer. Doesn't matter how old he was going to be put away. Otherwise, the jury would have been deliberating much longer than 4 hours.
Yeah, there would have been more doubt about convicting him.
Yeah. Especially at his age. According to an Ottawa newspaper dated May 1st, 1964, Reginald was convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison today in the Christmas-time slaying of 4 persons in a Roman Catholic rectory. And that was another strike against him, that it was done at Christmas in a church. Socially unacceptable.
Yeah.
He was exempt from the death penalty because he was a day short of his 18th birthday at the time, and thus a minor. So if he would have waited another day or so to commit that crime, he would have been treated as an adult. And, like we said, death penalty still existed in Ontario.
And actually, the other brother, he was 22, who unalived himself. He would have got the death penalty.
He would have faced the death penalty anyway, but I'm sure it was a case where, he didn't want to be caught at all. So if it wasn't going to work out for him, he was going to unalive himself. Like, you can't catch him. And technically, they didn't catch him. I guess in his own mind, he was ending it before he got caught. So, but I guess he would have known that he was facing the death penalty. So I think it's one way or the other, right?
Yeah.
So I couldn't find any other details about Reginald's incarceration. So I'm just assuming that he ended up in Kingston Pen. I actually looked in the list of the history of Kingston Penitentiary's inmates, and I couldn't find his name. There were only so many federal institutions that existed at that time still. So I'm assuming he was sent to Kingston Pen. It's almost as if he were sent away and forgotten, because literally there is not anything else about him or really about the family.
Yeah.
I tried researching the case as well in a database that I have access to, and could not find anything, even the case itself. The only thing I really came across was newspaper articles. So that was how I could piece together a lot of the information. But Reginald sort of disappeared. I even searched obituaries in case he had passed on by now. But I just found one for his older brother, Robert. And Robert was the one who was in BC. And Robert passed away in 2011. But that's all I could find about the family and about the case. So Reginald's...
Who knows?
Question mark. I have no idea.
Yeah.
But anyway, we thought we would just share this holiday-related case with you. There's actually not too many.
No.
Which is, I mean,
That's
good.
good, yeah.
Good. But anyway, stay tuned. In the next little while, we're going to have a Christmas podcast for you. There's going to be some clips of a few other things on there as well, so stay tuned for that. Should be coming out maybe within a week from this video. Anyhow, we will see you in the next one. Bye, guys.